Good morning, everyone. I'm just waiting a second here until everyone gets in. We were just a few minutes late starting.
Thank you.
All right, so hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Erin Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Nova Scotia Association of Community Business Development Corporations, CBDCs for short. Today's webinar will focus on the World Bank. We've got a number of knowledgeable speakers to learn from, so I'm going to keep my remarks short. Many of you have attended our first two webinars and you've heard my spiel, but I do want to take a moment to give you a little bit of the context, so how we ended up offering this webinar series. So my organization, the CBDCs, we act as a project proponent for a number of export projects, and we thought that a really good in-depth look at IFIs would be a great topic to offer to Atlantic Canadian companies. Our objectives are to provide you with an overview of what IFIs are, how they work, what you need to know about working with them. We've done the overview, we've heard from the Caribbean Development Bank, and now today we're going to be drilling down on details for the World Bank. A quick thank you to my favorite consultants, Paula Green and Arturo Mena. They've been managing the logistics and all the things behind the scenes to bring this series together. And I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the support from the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. In addition to the funding support that they provided for these webinars, Craig Williams has been a very integral part of the planning and execution of these webinars. And I'm going to ask Craig in a moment to introduce our speakers. The quick housekeeping items as before we get going there. We have a number of speakers on our agenda, but we have left time at the end for questions. We started off the series with the intent of using the Q&A function, but everyone's more comfortable with using the chat, so that's fine. So you can put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, whatever works for you. And we will pose those at the end. If you do prefer to verbalize your question, just ask in the chat to be unmuted, and our host can do that on the back end so that you can speak. The session will be recorded, and we will be sharing a copy of the recording and the slide decks to all of you after the webinar. We're also going to be sending out a survey afterwards. I'd ask you to please fill that out. It really helps us with planning for future webinars and events. So Craig, I'll ask you to introduce our first speaker. Enjoy.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It is 11 o'clock here in sunny Halifax today. I think we're expecting up to 12, so we're excited about that. Thank you, Erin, and thank you for partnering with us on this project. We're delighted to have you guys, as you guys do partner with us on the Nova Scotia Association of CBDCs on a number of different trade projects, and we're delighted. Thank you kindly. I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. My name is Craig Williams, and I work with the Nova Scotian division in the trade division here in Halifax, and we fund and partner with organizations like Erin's to do research, run international trade missions, training for companies that want to advance their skills in international trade, and we also do pathfinding support for individual companies. Not going to get too much further into that. I'm also actually the private sector liaison officer for the World Bank. It's a network of 155 officers from about 100 countries around the world. We have about 10 here in Canada, and I'm the one for Nova Scotia. There's also one for for New Brunswick and Newfoundland. Essentially, the PSLO network is a conduit between business and the World Bank and other IFIs to be able to provide direction, support initiatives, and to be a lightning rod in our individual regions for activities, IFI activities. So essentially that's the broad strokes. We have a great lineup here today. We're excited for the speakers that we have. We're very fortunate actually, because the information that we're going to get is really from people that are plugged in with the World Bank, have vast experience, and have their fingers on what's transpiring, what the priorities are with the World Bank, and how that can be relevant to our companies. The first contact and person who's going to speak is our friend, Leah Johnson, who I'm delighted to be able to introduce as our first speaker. Leah is the IFI officer, which is the Office of the Liaison of International Financial Institutions with Global Affairs Canada. She's a trade commissioner based in Washington, D.C. Leah is going to be speaking with us about how LIFIs can support Canadian companies. Hard to mention Leah's name or bring her name to mind without mentioning her partner in her office, Julie Mann. Both of those people work in tandem and have been a tremendous resource to us in our energies in supporting IFI awareness here in Atlantic Canada. Leah, as I said, is a trade commissioner. She covers the international financial institutions, but prior to joining the team, Leah was a procurement officer with aid-funded businesses with the Department of International Trade at the British Embassy in Washington. In this role, she helped companies from the United Kingdom navigate and find success with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So she has vast experience beyond the World Bank. I want to introduce you as a good friend and support to Atlantic Canadian business. Please welcome Leah Johnston.
Thank you so much, Craig, for the kind words and introduction. And thank you, Aaron, as well, for allowing us to be a part of this event today. Let me just pull up my presentation. Okay. So good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Johnston. I'm a trade commissioner based at the Embassy of Washington, based at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. I'm in the Office of Liaison with the International Financial Institutions. We call ourselves IFIs for short, and we're part of a global network of trade commissioners that focus on the IFIs and supporting Canadian companies to access business opportunities financed by the IFIs. I'll be joined by my colleague, Laura Dorling, who's a senior advisor in the Office of the Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean to the World Bank Group. I'm going to be talking about the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service and the IFI and PSLO networks. Laura will cover the role of the Executive Directors team and provide some insights on priorities on World Bank finance projects in Latin America and the Caribbean and how Canadian companies can access those opportunities. So first thing is explaining what we do as a LIFIs. So for those of you who are not aware of the Trade Commissioner Service, our role is to support Canadian companies as they export and expand their business around the globe. Most trade commissioners are sector focused, but the IFI trade commissioners are a little bit different because we're covering institutions. And as any of you have worked with any of these institutions know, they work across energy, infrastructure, water, healthcare, education, and kind of everything in between. So our role is to sort of act as a conduit for Canadian companies with these institutions, demystify how they operate, help you understand how they're structured, identify qualified key contacts within these institutions, and that can either be based in Washington or in World Bank country offices, and help you understand at which level to go in, and where each team fits within the World Bank structure. We can also resolve problems that may arise during the procurement process and advise companies on their rights as bidders and as contractors and help them understand World Bank procurement policies. We also spend a lot of time kind of explaining how the World Bank functions, how they procure services, the differences between corporate and operational procurement. And we also coordinate Canadian participation in key events. Normally we do a sector-specific trade mission in Washington to the World Bank. Our last one was in 2019 on climate smart energy solutions. We also do business outreach in Canada. We were in Atlantic Canada February of 2020 before everything shut down. And lately what we've been doing is a lot of webinars. We've done some World Bank 101 to kind of explain the World Bank Group. We also did one on the COVID-19 response with the World Bank Group and the business opportunities that arose from it. And we're also doing one coming up on the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So we're trying to still get the information out there and help companies better understand these institutions. We also disseminate business opportunities. Usually when we know that there's Canadian expertise in a specific subsector or country or region, or if we know that it's a unique opportunity that might only come around every 5 years or something like that. All the IFIs are co-located with the major IFIs. So as I mentioned, I'm in Washington covering the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as the 2 U.S. agencies for international development, USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, as well as the New York agencies of the UN. For the purpose of this presentation, we're just focusing on the World Bank, but if you are interested in those other institutions, feel free to reach out to me. You heard from my colleague Tammy Brathwaite last week, who is based in Bridgetown covering the Caribbean Development Bank. Ulaj Kamara is based in Abidjan covering the African Development Bank. Lily Zhu covers the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Grimmy Guarco is based in Manila covering the Asian Development Bank. All of our contact information is on this slide, and this will be shared with everyone following the end of this event. Please feel free to reach out to my colleagues directly if you're interested in the other institutions, or I'm always happy to make introductions as well. Next slide. Okay, so last thing that I'd like to talk about is the Private Sector Liaison Officer Network. Craig talked about it before, and it's kind of a group that started by the World Bank about 20 years ago. And it's a group of business intermediary organizations based all around the globe that kind of facilitate contact with the World Bank group and their communications to the private sector. It's a group that's recognized by almost all the other IFIs as well. And they sort of act as a voice of their private sector, and they disseminate World Bank knowledge, research, and events such as spring meetings, which were just last week. Craig is obviously the PSLO for Halifax. We have, as he mentioned, PSLOs for all provinces. And there's a website where you can find all the information on the World Bank website on PSLOs. So with that, I will hand back over to Craig. And thank you again for allowing me to present.
You're on mute,
You're
Craig.
still muted.
Really good information too, actually. Thank you so much, Leah. I really appreciate your time here with us today, and want to encourage everybody, if you have questions and need direction, please reach out to Leah. She and Julie are great resources. Next in our list, I'm going to introduce Laura Durling van der Oord, Senior Officer of the Office of the Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean to the World Bank Group. Laura's going to be speaking to us and provide insights on priorities and the World Bank financing projects in the Americas and how Canadian companies can access these opportunities. Laura joined the Office of the Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean for the World Bank Group in July 2012. In a role as Senior Advisor, she maintains board-level responsibilities and helps shape and approve investments in developing countries financed by the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. Laura also manages private sector programming and client engagement to promote global markets for procurement and investment opportunities in developing countries, increase flows of private capital to emerging markets, and support the World Bank Group's efforts to maximize financing for development. All to say that, you know, I sit in on calls probably once a month where Laura has a regular piece in the agenda, and you're going to be hard pressed to find somebody who has the insight and current knowledge in the workings of the World Bank for us and to be able to relate to us. So I'd like to introduce Laura. Please, everyone, pay attention because Laura is going to provide us with a ton of information, and it's going to be very relevant. So thank you and welcome, Laura.
Great. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Craig, and very generous introduction at that. It's a real pleasure to join you today, albeit virtually, in the sunny day in Halifax in Atlantic Canada. I really wanted to thank the organizers as well, especially CBDC and ACOA, of course, both Aaron and Craig with us today, and also colleagues at Global Affairs Canada, Leah and Stephanie at the World Bank Group for making the time. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you. And I appreciate the time people are making to help educate about the opportunities that exist in the Latin America Caribbean region on World Bank finance projects. So with that being said, I'll just say first and foremost that, often people are thinking about Latin America and the Caribbean, they tend to think first of the Inter-American Development Bank, actually my former employer, which I know well, and also the Caribbean Development Bank. And I would just say that the World Bank Group actually plays a very active role in Latin America and the Caribbean. In our particular office, we are representing Canada, Ireland, and 11 Caribbean countries, mainly those of the English-speaking Caribbean, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago. And I would say that we have a really robust program, so I'll have the chance to touch on that today. I will give you a sense of some of the broader priorities, and of course, anything energy related, we will have the opportunity to hear from Stephanie, and there's no one better placed than her to be sharing some insights on their active work program. So with that being said, I just want to confirm people can see the slides on your side. Okay, excellent. So with that being said, in terms of the role of the Executive Director's Office, to pick up where Leah had left off, we first and foremost are representing the countries I've mentioned as shareholders to the institution. Now that includes basically everything you would expect at the level of Board of Directors, but representing the interests regarding the governance, the oversight, the fiduciary duty of the institution, and of course the financial sustainability as well of the World Bank Group. But that also entails a function where we do review and approve the financing that goes in through World Bank projects. So it's a delight to be here with you today. Part of the role we also play is to help people like yourselves on the call to educate yourselves as to where the information is, to be staying kept abreast of these opportunities. So what I'll do is quickly show you some of the resources where you can further reference going forward.
Laura?
Yeah?
I just want to point out that if you could just, as we went through at the very beginning, just to bring your slide presentation into view mode.
Can you just click from beginning up in the upper corner there? And that should, perfect. Click on that.
Okay, great. I had clicked, but I'm glad you flagged that it hadn't gone through. Is it better now?
It's perfect now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So, just as a starter slide here, I know you've already had some earlier sessions on this, but just to recap for today, the World Bank Group does comprise of 5 different institutions. And for purposes of today, we will be focusing largely on that of which we call the World Bank. And that's ultimately where we work with governments, both in middle income countries and low income developing countries through what we call the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. So just to as a refresher, that this is largely the financing that goes into support development projects, largely being managed by governments. With that being said, as an institution, we have 2 twin goals, overarching goals. One is to end extreme poverty by 2030, and also to promote shared prosperity. And in that context, there are a lot of different avenues here, different development priorities that we focus on. Just to give you an idea, I mean, clearly this has been an unprecedented year globally, and COVID-19 response has clearly been the most urgent and most pressing need, I'd say, within the last 12 months. The World Bank is playing a very active role. In fact, we have more than 100 projects already up and running, and not only designed, but being implemented. So clearly there's been a big institutional push to help developing countries best meet these needs, try to help them combat COVID-19 and their individual country circumstances. Apart from that, we always do prioritize work in human capital, investments in health and education, and also climate investments is a really big priority for us. So in fact, we do have a new target of 35% of annual commitments will be allocated to climate related investments. And that actually has had a big impact. I've seen a huge momentum then, of course, in the energy sector. We're also seeing heightened attention to transport as well, just knowing that if we're really going to globally reduce GHG emissions, we need to be really taking a good look at what we can do in the energy sector and transport as well. Of course, agribusiness and other sectors fall in that category as well. Energy access, of course, is a major priority globally, and certainly we'll hear from Stephanie as well in terms of the LAC region. But of course, gender equality and financial inclusion, anything and everything else that you could imagine. So just really quickly, I'm just going to touch on this in terms of the COVID response. If we look at this specifically in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, we do have 32 projects right now for a total of $1.57 billion. And I mention this only because a big push has been obviously to help contain the impact, both the health impact, the number of cases, but also the economic impact. So trying to provide liquidity to support the region as best we can at this critical juncture. And we have had a recent update, and unfortunately, the LAC region has been particularly hard hit in terms of number of cases, and also in terms of economic impact has actually been the hardest hit of all regions to date globally. But if we take a broader lens, if we take a look at what we're doing in the overall portfolio, and I've just pulled this up this week, so it should be fairly accurate here for you, but we're looking at about 420 projects in total that are either pipeline or active projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. Pipeline to us really means that these are projects that are in development. So there are often opportunities that arise at this stage to work directly with the World Bank to help shape these projects on largely a consulting basis. But then there are also the bulk of the activities and opportunities for people like yourselves in the private sector arise during the stage of active project implementation. And depending on the scope of the project, this can extend, you know, from 1 to 4 or even longer years for very complex projects. If we look at the sectors, for instance, you'll see that there's actually no sector left behind, I'd say, in the Latin America Caribbean region, really depending on what the priorities are of the governments and where best the World Bank can help support their development priorities. So everything ranging from public administration, agriculture, water sanitation, social protection, you know, transport, health, you know, industry and related services, education, of course, energy is a major priority. ICT, of course, is increasingly important, and financial inclusion as well. So I would encourage you to take a look at this. You can basically go to this website that I've included there after the session and take a closer look. In terms of the Caribbean, I really wanted to put a spotlight on some pressing needs. Obviously, again, this is a very unique region where they have significant economic potential. I know many of you have experience already working in the region, and they do have tremendous amount of growth opportunities, but they also do remain extremely vulnerable to natural hazards. And unfortunately, we're witnessing this real time in the context of the recent volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the impacts in St. Vincent, but also in the entire region, with many countries being affected. So the World Bank is very actively involved in trying to get some immediate support there. But in terms of the region as a whole, we have actually $1.73 billion in both lending to the middle income countries and the lower income financing, and for a total of 45 projects. And ultimately, these examples of priority sectors, I guess, could be captured in a way that, you know, obviously focus on resilience and capacity building. And that pertains to COVID-19 pandemic. It also largely has focused on climate mitigation and adaptation. As we know, the area is very affected, as I mentioned, by climate-related disasters. And ultimately, that is a major priority for the region, for each country. That includes disaster risk management, building back better, and strengthening their resilience, both in terms of fiscal, social, and physical infrastructure. Of course, there's a big priority also to focus on economic diversification. So looking at renewable energy, blue economy is a newer area for opportunities, and the digital economy. And actually there is a very large Caribbean digital transformation project that has been approved for the OECS countries. This is the largest investment in digital of its kind. So I'd encourage you to take a look. And just briefly, in terms of how you actually access these opportunities, I think I've given you a sense of the scale and scope of involvement of the World Bank Group in the region. But ultimately, there are different avenues for you to be involved. And one in particular is direct contracting with the World Bank Group. And particularly for those of you that are smaller in size, or maybe don't have the bandwidth to be really globally pursuing larger scale projects, it can be a very useful way for yourselves as firms or even individuals to be involved through what we call corporate procurement, where the World Bank staff itself would be your client, and continue to be helping to shape and deliver on projects. And I will give you an example of where you find those opportunities through an online platform called eConsultant 2. Apart from that, you can also work on World Bank finance projects with client countries. And this is largely the bulk of what we do through operational procurement. And that's for all of the above: goods, works, non-consulting services, and consulting services. So I'll also leave you with a couple of tools there. But of course, I would recommend subcontracting and partnering as well. There are a lot of people who are very experienced in the world of IFI business that have robust experience working with the World Bank. And I would encourage you to partner in and bring in your comparative advantage as best you can. Of course, there are opportunities with the International Finance Corporation and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency as our private sector arms, but that would be where you would be working more closely with project sponsors and actual investors in the region. So just to keep in mind, though, that this is a very competitive environment. As you're pursuing these opportunities, I can assure you, so are many others. And so it's very important to make sure that you are focusing on what your particular expertise is, what your capability is, and how you can deliver and help support these projects. Of course, there's an investment required to put the teams and proposals together. And also important to keep in mind that, again, the client countries themselves are defining these projects, but as a result of that, there are significant opportunities. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples here. This is just a screenshot of an earlier screenshot this week of corporate procurement examples. You'll see where you can actually go in each one to see exactly what they're looking for. This unfortunately isn't able to search by region. It does show globally across both the World Bank and in this case also IFC and MEGA, what the internal needs are for hiring externally for consulting services. So I would encourage you to look at that. I wanted to leave you with this as well. It's just an overview of the country pages where you can actually access easily the types of World Bank finance projects in each country. I would encourage you to take a look. This is just one example, for instance, of Jamaica, where you can see the World Bank is involved from everything from the COVID-19 response, as you can imagine, but through to competitiveness and growth project. Also economic resilience, as I had mentioned earlier, and rural economic development, everything to climate resilience in the fishery sector that may be of interest to some of you, and even access to finance for MSMEs. So that's just one example, but I would encourage you to look case by case. I've also included some reference here for you. We have an excellent handbook that was actually prepared by the World Bank former chief of procurement, and it actually highlights here how to find business opportunities and some tips as to how to win these contracts. That link below will get you there, and wanted you to take a look at that. It does cover both corporate procurement, as I mentioned, and importantly operational procurement, as we've touched on. And there is also a newer system now for alerts where you can basically self-register, so that as there are new project documents or new announcements related to particular countries or sectors, you can actually sign up to be kept apprised. I'm also leaving you with a pretty robust list here of some of the key information sources, so all of you can really match up your comparative advantage and your areas of expertise with what's actually happening in each country and each sector. And I left you here also with some suggested approaches, which I've already touched on, but I thought I would leave this in just so that you have a bit of a referral tool for later on. But again, really would encourage you to work closely with your support network. You have all of the right people on the call here today to help you do that. I know we work very closely, of course, with the Office of Liaison, with the IFIs, Leah and Julie, as mentioned, in Washington. But you do want to be kept abreast of these opportunities, and there's plenty of information out there. So we have an entire team able to assist and help you navigate these opportunities. And I like to encourage people to link your World Bank group related efforts and your broader IFI interests to your broader market strategies for countries. If you're active in any market, you should also be kept abreast as to what type of IFI financing is there, what type of related opportunities. And first and foremost, really to understand who your client is, whether it is somebody that you would be working and targeting opportunities to work with the World Bank directly as your client through corporate procurement, or if you would be looking to be involved with the country itself, the executing agency in country as your client. So with that said, I'll stop there, but thanks again for the opportunity and very much looking forward to the rest of the presentations.
Just making sure I'm off mute. I am. Okay. Thank you very much, Laura. That was fabulous. A ton of information there, and there have been a couple of questions that have popped up as you've been speaking. If we can just hold a minute or a few minutes for the questions. We're only going to be here for roughly an hour to an hour and a half, or about 75 minutes. So we have one more presentation. If we could keep our questions, and we'll get to them at the end as we suggested. So, but appreciate you writing them down now so that we keep them. And I can imagine there's a ton more. So thank you very much, Laura, and for that comprehensive overview. Next, our next speaker, we're drilling down a little bit further. Laura gave us a broader perspective of the World Bank, and it is enormous. If my memory serves me correct, there's about 16,000 staff with the World Bank. I forget what the annual budget is, but it's significant. It's one of the larger global multilaterals. And it's one in which the government of Canada is a shareholder. So it's very relevant to us. Our next speaker is Stephanie Gill, Practice Manager for Energy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Ms. Gill will be speaking to us on the World Bank's role in supporting the energy sector transition in Latin America and the Caribbean. Ms. Gill is, as I said, she leads the World Bank's energy sector engagements, including regulatory reforms, disruptive technologies, new financing architecture, and other operations in the region. Ms. Gill is a Spanish and French national, joined the World Bank Group in 2013 as energy specialist and focused on Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Sub-Saharan Africa before joining the Latin America and Caribbean Group. She has extensive experience in power utilities, competitive power and gas markets, and energy sector reforms. Previously, she held several senior positions with the French utility EDF in the UK and France. I just met Stephanie prior to us coming on, but I'd like to give a warm Atlantic Canadian welcome to you, Stephanie, and the floor is yours, and you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Craig, for the extensive introduction. It doesn't make me feel any younger, but thank you. It was very kind of you. Let me thank you very much, as well as Erin, Paula, and Lucia for inviting me to this session. And I'm very delighted to be joining Leah and Laura and to build on their prior presentation. Let me just check that from a technology standpoint, you can see the slides in shared mode. Thank you very much. And simply to say that here, so what I would like to do over the next few minutes is to drill down a little bit on the contribution of the World Bank to the energy sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what I will do is I will first give you a sense of the challenges in the region before focusing on what the strategy for World Bank Group engagement in the region is, and illustrating that engagement through specific investments and specific areas of consulting opportunities, so specific technical assistance, analytical work that we do. And before diving into the challenges, so generally we see the energy sector in Latin America and the Caribbean as being very sophisticated. This is a sector that has gone through multiple waves of reform since the early 80s, so a pioneer region in the same vein as California, or say the United Kingdom in Europe. And so this is a region that is also very green. It's got the cleanest energy mix in the world as a region, probably if we contrast it with Canada, so there would be some competition there. But so from a region standpoint, it's very green due to its reliance and its on hydropower, which could be, I think, an area of opportunity. And it is, for that reason, also a region that has benefited from more private sector participation than other regions in which the World Bank works. So it is, in a way, a pioneering region in which we learn and then replicate into other regions of the World Bank. However, this doesn't mean that the region is not facing its own sets of challenges, including in the energy sector. And one of them, and so I think it's a subject that is perhaps a little bit dissociated also from the region, is that so access rate is one of the highest in which the World Bank works in terms of region. Most of the countries have north of 95% access to electricity. However, there's substantial disparities from country to country. So of course, even if we make an exception of Haiti, which is even falling behind the sub-Saharan African electrification rate, we still have substantial differences. For instance, in countries in Central America, still in some countries in the Caribbean region where the access rate is well below 95%, 100%. Then another point is that of inequality is within country. So this is a region that is also deeply unequal. And so within countries, there will be substantial disparity in terms of access and in terms of quality of electricity that you get. If you're, say, for instance, in Santiago de Chile, in the most advanced country in the region, or whether you're in the south of that very same country. This situation also applies to, say, for instance, Argentina, which is also a very advanced country. And so that means that for people who don't live in the capital cities or in the central cities, they will have much more interrupted supply of electricity, which means they won't have the same sort of quality of internet if they wish to connect to the internet, which means that their firms also will suffer because they will have interruptions in cold chains, etc. So there's a massive disparity. And this is also reflected in the price of electricity that people get. So again, this is one of the regions that is facing the most inequality country to country and within country between the wealthier part of the population based in the capital cities and those based in more rural areas. One way to illustrate this, and I think it's an example that is quite telling, is that of Honduras. So Honduras, on average, is also a country that is not faring very well. But when we say, okay, 85%, 84% of households have access to electricity versus, say, 45% on average in sub-Saharan Africa, you think there's no problem. We don't need to consider the issue of access of electricity in Honduras. But if you drill a little bit deeper, what you find is that a little over than half of the population actually have a large number of interruptions. So they're in a category where they can have 8 hours of electricity a day. This is considered access. It's 8 hours of very heavily interrupted electricity access a day. And so this means that there's still a lot of work to be done in the basic infrastructure, in terms of working with the utility, and in terms of helping the more vulnerable categories of the population, not only having better standards of living, but having the economic opportunities to grow. So I wanted also to touch base on the subject of climate change and resilience. I think Laura mentioned very well that resilience is one of the first words that springs to mind when we talk about the Caribbean. It's actually also an issue in the rest of the continent. And it is so almost ironically, because this continent benefits from this enormous hydropower potential, which now is being more and more affected by climate change. So this means that in a way, and apologies also for not perhaps being very generous, but the region has slept on its laurels for decades, benefiting from cheap, abundant hydropower. And now this is a situation that is evolving rapidly, leading to curtailments in countries such as Colombia, Brazil, where it's unprecedented. And so this has now spurred a lot of activity, also building on the fact that there are other sources of renewable energy that the countries can tap into. And so, the largest single power region for hydropower is the Atacama Desert in Chile. And there are other regions that could benefit from solar power, from wind power, from offshore wind, which is also seen as a key opportunity in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Colombia, for instance. And this would be a way of further greening their energy mix. On the one hand, reducing costs and also improving the resilience of their sectors. So it seems almost ironic that we say so the region, so Latin America contributes less than 10% to global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's already a great contributor, but we think that it also can further push the contribution in terms of being a leading region on addressing climate change and on reducing their own impacts, given their own vulnerabilities. So at the moment, we see on average about half of all the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the region come from energy, electricity, transport, and industry. Those are some of the areas that are the most straightforward to tackle. The rest, of course, comes from agriculture and land use and land use change, which are a little more complex to tackle. But in terms of electricity, in terms of transport, and in terms of industry, those are seen as some of the potential lower hanging fruits, where decisive action in terms of climate, and we'll get onto some examples, can help this region become, well, benefit from its competitive advantage and grow economically. And this is becoming particularly important in the context of what Laura had mentioned also, which is that this is a region that has been most drastically affected by the crisis. So the contraction in 2020 was 6.7% across the region, 6.7% of GDP. Impact is a lot larger in the Caribbean, and there's some disparity countries to countries. But there's a massive effort that needs to be focused now. So building on the efforts on health, on the efforts on social protection, on reactivation for the SMEs, on a broader sustainable economic reactivation. And we see that the energy sector can be a key contributor to this. And the final point I'd like to make before moving to the strategy is the topic of private sector participation. Again, the Latin America region and the energy sector have been pioneers in reforms and introducing much more private sector participation. What has happened is that in reality, in the end, the private sector only has delivered part of what was expected for it to deliver. So if we see simply the investments in infrastructure, so here in infrastructure, I'm covering energy, transport, and water. So if we compare the level of investments in infrastructure as percent of GDP prior to the reform years and introduction of private sector participation in the early 80s, if we contrast those levels of 4%, 3%, so in aggregate 4.2%, if we contrast those levels to what we've observed in the past 3 decades, those levels of investments are halved. And this is very much one of the drivers behind deteriorating quality of supply of electricity, deteriorating quality of road infrastructure, etc. So LAC has only invested about 2% per year of GDP in infrastructure. And there's a need to spur a lot more investment to motivate this economic reactivation, green economic reactivation, but also more basically to deliver on the potential for Latin America, close those equity gaps that still exist in society. We calculated that this level of investment would need to be 3 to 4 times higher, the level of investment in infrastructure than what it currently is, or what it has been on average for the past 30 years for Latin America to close this infrastructure gap. And so there are massive opportunities both for the private sector, obviously, but also still for the public sector. So this leads on to the situation that the countries are facing. They have an opportunity to transform again and to pioneer again another wave of reforms, building on new technological changes. So, of course, we're thinking of variable renewable energy, such as offshore wind, solar, which are now mature. Also, electric mobility. So this is becoming a very large topic in the context of decarbonization and net zero. And subjects such as green hydrogen also to help decarbonize the wider economy. And here, so there's a multi-angle lens that the bank is applying to support this transformation. One, which is, of course, on building on the technological changes and implementing the policies, regulation norms that will help those transformations. There's work at the level of the utilities. Many of them are privatized, some of them are still public. In all cases, the level of investments are still insufficient to bridge that infrastructure gap, including on the energy sector. So we're working with them. Excuse me, my little helper has just interrupted me. And so working on the financing aspects, because one of the issues for the region is attracting innovative financing into resolving their issues. Yes, apologies. And so between those aspects of working on the fundamentals of the markets and the sectors, working on the fundamentals of the utility and the right conducive policy environment, and working on the financing. So this is the multi-pronged approach that the bank is supporting to spur what we call a third generation of reforms. And so we work broadly on the themes of utility of the future, of social and climate resilience and trying to close those existing gaps. And again, this innovative finance through new PPP models, but also funds where sometimes the public sector needs to make a first step, for instance, in energy efficiency, working on the consumer end, before the private sector gains confidence and a new market is created that delivers new local jobs, new growth opportunities. And so if I may now, so moving from the World Bank strategy to some example of areas in which we're currently focusing. So as illustrated, I think in Laura's ranking, so the energy sector is one of the sectors in which the World Bank engages in infrastructure. And you will see that the portfolio varies, of course, widely because it focuses on different subjects according to different regions. But I'd like to highlight a few. And one of them is helping a green transition and so of the electricity mix. And this is particularly relevant in Central America and in the Caribbean, where a lot of the energy production still relies on fossil fuels, which are polluting, which are extremely expensive, and which are imported. So from an economic standpoint, from an affordability standpoint and a competitiveness standpoint, it really makes sense to shift that mix. And so we're working on geothermal in a number of countries. We're working on renewable energy through guarantee instruments to attract the private sector. And so this is, for instance, in Argentina, in Haiti, in Dominica, in St. Lucia. So those are examples of countries. The second subject is on the supporting the transition and the reforms. And here, so I'd like to highlight the example of Brazil with this energy and mineral sector strengthening project. And also the example of the Dominican Republic, working on reduction of losses in the distribution grid while modernizing the utility. So this is an example of work on those aspects. And I wanted to also highlight the example of innovative financing. And there, so the example that we like to boast about, if I may say, is the example of the Argentina Renovar Guarantee Fund project. So this was an innovative facility in which the bank designed an auction mechanism to attract financing into renewable energy in a country that essentially had 0% non-hydro renewable energy in 2017 as part of its energy mix. And now through this innovative financing that attracted the private sector in 2020 had 10% penetration of new variable renewable energy. And this is building in a work that was done jointly with MIGA and IFC on an innovative financing mechanism to attract the private sector. So this is to illustrate the efforts on reform, on transition of renewable energy and energy efficiency. I didn't mention our Mexico project, but that's an example of energy efficiency on the demand side. And then on the innovative financing that was successful in Argentina and that we're attempting to replicate in other countries. Now, because of the level of sophistication of our countries, and I will stop there, the vast majority of our effort is actually more on our advisory services and analytics portfolio. And I think this is where there's also lots of opportunities for consulting engagements. Here, so I will also highlight a few elements. So of course, all the work on renewable energy is extremely relevant, be it on assessing of resources potential, assessment of the existing policy, regulatory, normative framework, looking at the market opportunities so that you can develop the investments. So renewable energy is clearly an area. Energy efficiency, so the demand side is one that we're starting to spur, and we have work that was initiated in Central America, in particular Panama, Costa Rica, Brazil also. And again, the idea is to reduce to the largest extent possible the bill for the customer. So energy efficiency, renewable energy, carbon pricing instruments. So this is an area that is extremely relevant also in the country to help in this energy transition. And the bank has been involved in supporting 7 different countries in establishing either a carbon tax or a carbon market. This is a multi-year, multi-pronged, multi-sectoral piece of work that is often led by the energy sector. So of the 7 engagements, 6 were led by the energy sector, 1 by our environment colleagues. They're called partners. They've been, so that those market instruments are proving to be very critical to help the region through its transition. And so other areas are broader and both broader and more specific in terms of helping the countries in supporting their own reform. And so at the moment we have an engagement in Peru, in Colombia, in Brazil, and in the Dominican Republic, which aims at helping the countries through their third wave of reform. And I think I will stop there. Merci, gracias, thank you. The intent again was to present a brief overview of the challenges in the region, what the bank's strategy for engagement is in quite specific areas, given how sophisticated the region is, and then examples of investments that are ongoing, and the very large technical assistance portfolio also, where I hope there could be opportunities for you to engage. Thanks very much.
Stephanie, just before you you put yourself on mute, is your child gone? Or can you put your child on the line to say hello? Or
oh, so I managed to. So it's one of the two, and you know I did lock the door, but you know they turned 3 and they managed to find how to unlock the door. So
that's brilliant. You know, this is very. It's you know this is part of working from home, and we all understand that, and it's very relevant. So please, I'm amazed by your focus. You did a. You didn't seem to get distracted at all. So thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. You know, you really started with, you know, the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean, and drilled down and kind of in a very kind of easy to follow process of understanding the problems and challenges that exist currently and a little bit historically. So, and then giving us examples of what the World Bank is doing and the types of projects that you guys are supporting. You know, I really found your material very poignant and easy to follow. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. So now I'm going to pass back over to Erin, and Erin's going to lead us through the next section.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks very much, Stephanie. I'll give you my trick. I have 3 kids, and I keep some treats on in my desk drawer. So I'm like, here, have some candy. Go away. It works really well. Perfect. So for the question time we've got left here, there are a few that have come through the chat. I'll pose those, and if anyone has any other ones, they can use the Q&A or the chat to ask those, and we'll get to those. First question was, would the World Bank work with corporations like the CCC, which I'm thinking is Canadian Commercial Corporation, to access financing support for identified projects? I'm not sure who would be best to answer that, if anyone wants to chime in.
Leah, did you want to go ahead with that, or do you want me to cover it from my end?
I'd say you can take it, Laura.
Sorry,
Okay.
I didn't realize I was unmuted. You can go ahead. I'll fill in after you.
Okay, great. Yeah, just in a nutshell, yes, I am also assuming, like you, Erin, that CCC, referring to the Canadian Commercial Corporation as one of the crown corporations in Canada. We do, and we have worked with CCC. Now, in terms of the question, I see it's referring specifically to access financing support for identified projects. So I would say, you know, CCC, where I've seen active engagement was with the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency on an energy project in Africa in particular. But I would say in terms of accessing financing specifically, we've tended to work closely with Export Development Canada, just because they are able to co-finance or even co-invest with the International Finance Corporation. So when it is a project that it has a private sector sponsor for actual investment, EDC tends to be the natural partner to be co-financing with IFC as our private sector arm. Now with CCC, they do have a variety of approaches, and they have worked certainly in Latin America, the Caribbean. They've had involvement with some prominent projects there. It tends to be largely bilaterally, directly to engage with the government directly and bringing in Canadian suppliers. So I would certainly encourage you to talk to them directly. On the World Bank side, we do tend to have a very robust and transparent openly competitive procurement process, and that's to make sure that Canadian firms and all others are able to keep abreast, really trying to get the best expertise, the best value for money on these projects. So if it's from the procurement angle, I would say we've had less engagement with CCC, where it tends to go openly competitive to market, but certainly they are a key partner.
Perfect, thanks, Laura. Another question that came through was, does the World Bank have a vendor of record program, so for pre-approved service providers?
So maybe I can start, and then Leah, if you have anything you'd like to add from your end. In most instances, we don't per se. Now, in very, very targeted areas, from time to time, there can be a pre-qualification or sort of a master roster. It does not happen as much, I would say, with the World Bank Group as what I have seen with some of the other regional development banks. It tends to be in areas, for instance, law firms where the World Bank or IFC would know that they would need to repeatedly go back for similar service, but across regions, and need to do so on a timely basis. We've seen a couple in very, very targeted areas where maybe there are only a handful of suppliers in that particular area of expertise. So in most instances, no, but not entirely unheard of. And I don't know if Stephanie, in your world, in the energy sector, just as you get more and more unique expertise, if you've seen that from an operational side of things, but maybe I'll turn it to Leah in case there's anything to add there. Maybe Stephanie has some views to share as well.
Thank you, Laura. And to reiterate what she said, I'm not aware of a vendor of record requirement per se, but if you're bidding on opportunities on eConsult, which is the World Bank's website where you'll find a lot of the consulting services opportunities, you can register as a vendor. It's usually fairly quick and simple, although it's not required. I think if you do, if you are successful and win, then they ask you to register at that point, but I'm not aware of a vendor of record. And I know there's other aid agencies that have opportunities like that, where you're sort of pre-qualified to respond to a business opportunity, and they'll put out business opportunities designed for that thing, but I'm not aware of any besides the legal services, like what Laura said, for the World Bank. But I'll hand over to Stephanie if she has anything else to add.
Gracias. Thank you. So I just wanted to reconfirm again what Laura and Leah said. So it is rather unusual to have a vendor of record approach. Gracias, Reina. So I have one exception in mind, which is for extremely rapid assessments, for instance, of potential of rooftop solar in cities, where I know that there is a standing contract, again, which is meant to be a 24-hour type turnaround service with a couple of firms. And so that's, I think, the only specific area that I'm aware of, and I think it's because it's still quite specialized. But other than that, and some of the countries, for instance, Sub-Saharan Africa, needed to have access to that expertise very quickly and a large scale. But other than that, the process is typically a very competitive, transparent process. Thank you.
Safe to say that the environment that for the World Bank and most of the IFIs want to be transparent and competitive and strive to appear to be transparent and competitive as to ensure, and I know that we've talked about this, and this is an underlying premise in all of the IFIs, that there's a recourse as well, that if you're not happy with the process, which, seems when you're listening, it seems like, okay, well, but it's really, this is something that each of the IFIs really go out of their way to impress on the business community, that we are responsible guardians of our shareholders. We're driving home transparency. Is that all? That's the background of this?
It does, and maybe I can elaborate, but certainly what we want to do, given the amount of financing that does go in from donor countries like Canada and other countries into a place like the World Bank Group, and including the amount of government funding from the client countries themselves allocated to these projects, it's really important to have that level of transparency. And I think you'll see over the years we've evolved where there's a lot of information that is put out into the public, and that is very much intentional. It's also put out into the public at very early stages of project development. So some of the links that I shared there, I would encourage you to take a look. Sort of the first and foremost is that country partnership framework or strategy, where it tells you actually exactly which sectors the World Bank will be active in. It's also where the World Bank would have some comparative advantage to bring. And also then it drills down sort of for each project and right to the point where there's actually a procurement plan that will outline, you know, we really see it as a successful project implementation means you have to be carefully planning for that project. That also includes identifying what type of suppliers you'll need to actually implement these projects, what type of contractors, and at what stage of that project cycle, and how much funding or, you know, budget you're allocating for that at what point in the process. So I would encourage you to always drill down even to the level of the procurement plan. Again, these procurement plans are updated, of course, there can be delays, but that does tend to get updated as well. And all of that information is in the public domain for you to be viewing. And oftentimes well before a general procurement notice comes out, well before a specific procurement notice, again, you should be anticipating these opportunities through that project cycle. And that information is intentionally made available to you and of course to others. So it's important for you to make sure that you are as informed as possible.
Perfect.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Laura. One other question that came in there was, where can countries obtain seed financing for developing project ideas into fundable World Bank opportunities? Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
This is a common one we have in Washington. I don't know, Leah, otherwise I can start.
Go ahead, you can start.
Sure. I mean, it is a question we get often. Again, just keeping in mind the overall structure of the World Bank Group and how we're designed. The money that we have allocated to the institution is really intended to go to those projects that are largely defined by the countries themselves. And in that sense, there's not seed funding per se available to then develop projects that are then brought forward to the World Bank Group. Certainly, if you have ideas, you can also be comparing notes with client countries directly, that thereby as a client country, they could then ask for, prioritize that type of project. I would say with the exception of the International Finance Corporation, for instance, where we do have a smaller sort of venture capital and even infra ventures fund that is to help offset some of those earlier project development costs, but that's really associated with what would be a larger scale investment through some type of actual, you know, often infrastructure, energy, or related type project.
Yeah, and just to add to what Laura was saying, it wouldn't be something on the sovereign side of the bank, which is what I'm focused the majority of my time on. The opportunities that are being procured either on the operational or corporate side. I have a colleague, Fahim Noor Ali, who also works with us on the World Bank Group and covers off more on IFC and MEGA side, but in general on the sovereign side, everything is competitively bid. I have had companies that, you know, kind of influence and work with, they have strong relationships with the World Bank's borrowing member countries. And kind of work with them on different projects over the years, and they, you know, provide some influence at that level. But in general, you know, the World Bank and its partner countries are developing the country strategies, the projects, putting them out to international competition, and being advertised on their website, as well as other subscription services like DevX and Development Aid and things like that. So I don't know if that answers that, but just to kind of explain, it's different on the sovereign side versus the private sector arm, which is IFC.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Perfect. Thank you so much. And then that's all the questions that I see right now. So I think we've covered off what everyone was looking to ask, and we'll have your contact information if anyone's got anything that they think of afterwards. We'll reach out with those inquiries. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. A reminder to fill out the survey when it comes through your email. We really would like your feedback. We've got one more webinar coming up on Tuesday of next week. I hope you can join us for the last of our series there. And again, thank you so much to Stephanie and to Laura and to Leah for sharing today all of your expertise. We really appreciate it. Craig, anything further that you needed to bring up? No, we're good. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We're grateful. Take care.
Thanks.